Hi everyone, and welcome to this MoCRA webinar on roles in the supply chain. Today we'll be focusing on responsible person. So before I go into that, I will just give you a small introduction to myself. So I'm Kamal. I've worked in the regulatory industry for over 7 years now across a number of different companies. So I've worked for an FMCG, an e-commerce retailer and manufacturer, and also smaller luxury businesses as well, all within the cosmetics industry. So the last webinar, we focused on the role of the facility in the supply chain. And this week, we will be focusing on the responsible person and what that means in terms of MoCRA and how also that differs slightly from the UK and European definition of responsible person. As per usual, please enter any questions that you have, and I will get to those at the end, because I feel like this one might generate a few questions and some examples, which I'd be more than happy to work through. So let's begin with looking at what the definition of a responsible person is within the MoCRA regulation. So the definition of a responsible person is the manufacturer, packer, or distributor of a cosmetic product whose name appears on the label of such cosmetic product in accordance with Section 609A of MoCRA or Section 4A of the Fair Packaging and Labelling Act. And there are 3 different types of entities or establishments that could be a responsible person following this definition. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. So the US responsible person under MoCRA must be either the manufacturer, the packer, or the distributor, which is what we've just seen within the definition. One of those must appear on the product label, and you will usually find one of them does appear on the product label. So let's look at each one in a little bit more detail. So the manufacturer is the establishment or entity which produces the formulation. So the company that is making the formulation, they may be labelled on the cosmetic product label and may be viewed as the responsible person in the US. It can also be the packer. So this may be an entity that packs the bulk into bottles. They can also be viewed as the responsible person by the FDA under MoCRA. This one is probably the least likely. It's the example that I have never really come across, where the packer is actually labelled on the product. The one that is the most common is definitely the distributor. So this is the entity, the brand that is selling the formulation. And that is usually the brand name and usually what you will find on a cosmetic product label. So if you have one of these 3 on the product label, not only is it compliant with MoCRA, but that name and address or telephone number or electronic contact information, which I'll come on to in a little bit later, they will be viewed as the responsible person under MoCRA. So if you're the manufacturer, the packer or distributor, and you're on the label, you may be viewed as the responsible person under MoCRA following the definition. And the brand name is usually the most common, and that is generally what you will find on most cosmetic products rather than a manufacturer or a packer. So now we've looked at that, let's look at who can actually be the USRP. So we've already identified who it can be, but actually, what does that mean in real terms? So there have been various debates and conversations about where the USRP needs to be based. And I think that comes from the terminology that is being used. So the US responsible person, you would think they need to be based in the US, but actually there's no provision in MoCRA which states that the responsible person for the US needs to be based in the US. So if your brand name has a address on there that is outside of the US, that is technically still compliant, and they would still be viewed as the responsible person within the US, as well as other regions. I'll come on to some worked examples towards the end so you can see what this looks like in terms of an actual product label. Where the US RP role does differ from the UK and EU is that it cannot be legally designated to a third party. So within the European Union and the UK, as a brand, you can legally transfer that responsibility to a third party, such as a consultancy or agency, for them to actually be the responsible person and for them to be legally responsible for your cosmetic product, even though it's your brand. Within MoCRA, there is no provision which actually allows you to do this. So the US RP role must stay with the distributor, the manufacturer, or the packer. Legally, it cannot be transferred to a consultancy. However, that being said, you can still use consultancies and agencies like World Over to help you meet those obligations of MoCRA. So we can actually help you with the product listing, make sure that you have your supply chain fully mapped out, ensure that you have processes in place under MoCRA. And the only, I guess, element of that to consider is partnering with the right consultancy that is helping you meet those obligations, but they cannot take those legal obligations away from you under MoCRA. So ultimately, the legal responsibility and liability does remain with the USRP, which again, going back to those three examples, is the manufacturer, the packer, or the distributor, most likely to be the distributor. So let's go on to label information and what that looks like, again, in real terms, and add in some practical examples in. So the USRP must always be named on the product, and they can be named alongside either a domestic address or a domestic telephone number or electronic contact information, which is a website or email. It doesn't need to be all three of these. It can be a combination of two out of the three. It can just be the one. It really will depend on the brand and where they are located. So if you are US based, you are most likely to put your responsible person with a domestic address. If you're non-US based, you will probably lean towards the electronic contact information alongside the USRP name, just to ensure that you are meeting the obligations under MoCRA. I think one thing to really clear up at this point is that you do not necessarily need to update your labels before the end of, well, the 29th of December 2023 to meet the obligation of having a USRP under MoCRA. It is highly likely that you will have at least the website and the responsible person name, which is a manufacturer, a packer, or distributor on your label and are therefore compliant. But we will come on to some examples. So just bearing in mind the information that you currently have on the label, and we'll talk through whether that actually is compliant or not. But you can have various iterations. It's not one size fits all. There are different ways that you can present your responsible person information on the label. The key thing is to ensure that that name of the responsible person is the manufacturer, the packer, or the distributor, which in most, for most brands, that is the brand name. So if you are a brand owner, so coming on to a more real life example, and your brand name is on the label, that will be viewed as the RP by the FDA under MoCRA. And that is because your brand name is likely to be also the distributor, i.e. the seller of the product. And therefore, the brand owner will be the RP. In some cases, you may find that a brand owner also manufactures the product, and that will be viewed as the US RP as well. You can have some instances where the RP is both the brand name and the manufacturer, and you will find that for quite a lot of the larger brands as well, where they manufacture their own products, so they will be viewed as the US RP. If you are a non-US based brand who will be RP under MoCRA, you don't need to set up a legal entity or have that physical domestic US based address. So this is not something that is mandated under MoCRA. You As I mentioned earlier, you don't need to have a domestic address. You don't need to be legally present in the US. You don't need to have a US company in order to be a US RP. So let's look at a few examples of text that you may have on your label, how it's presented, and whether it actually meets the obligations under MoCRA. So if we work from left to right, so the first one has the brand name, a New York address, and a website. If we go back to the slide which has the label information on, this one is compliant because you have the name of the US responsible person, which in this case is the brand name. You also have a domestic address and you have electronic contact information. So having all three meets the requirements of the US responsible person under MoCRA and the labeling information that is required. Jump into the second example where you have the brand name and a UK address. This one is not compliant under MoCRA. And the reason being is that it doesn't have one of the three elements that's required on the product label. So it doesn't have a domestic address, it doesn't have a domestic telephone number, and it doesn't have any electronic contact information such as an email or website. The reason why this is so important is because consumers in the US need to be able to reach the brand in a way where they can report any adverse event information or any serious adverse event information. A consumer in the US is very unlikely to write a letter to a company in London. However, they will be more likely to visit the website and report the information around the adverse event that way instead. So the second example is not compliant where it just has a UK address, and it wouldn't be compliant if it just had an EU address either. So it's really key to make sure you have one of the three elements that we spoke about earlier. The third example where we have the brand name, a London address, but for this one, we also have a website address. So we have electronic contact information where the consumer is able to get in touch with the brand and let them know of any product issues or contact them if they need to for any other reason. So this one is compliant because you have that electronic contact information as well as the name of the US RP, which in this case would be the brand name. The final example, and probably the most common if you are UK and Europe based, you have your brand name, you have a UK RP address, and you also have a European RP address. And in this case, you also have website information. So this is compliant, and the reason being is because you have the website information. That is the element of this label example which meets the requirements under MoCRA. If I flash back to that previous slide, it only needs to be one of the three elements: a domestic address or telephone number or electronic contact information, which can be a website or email. So that final example is also compliant. If you do find that you maybe have more addresses on your label to meet other markets, or maybe you're still not sure if what you have on your label does actually meet the MoCRA requirements, please get in touch. We'd be more than happy to help and review these to make sure you are compliant by the 29th of December 2023. But it will be highly unlikely that you actually do need to update your labels to meet the requirements under MoCRA. So I hope that you found this information really useful, and these examples in particular, and also understood a little bit of the context around why certain information is needed on the label, and also who can actually be the US responsible person. So if you're ever thinking, I actually don't know who my responsible person is, look at your label, look at who is listed on there. If they are the manufacturer, the packer, or the distributor, they will be viewed as the responsible person in the US. And then obviously have the right contact information on that label as well. So that brings me to the end of this webinar. I hope you found that useful. But if you have any questions, please add them into the chat. Or if you have any examples that you want to bring to the table, please add those in and we're more than happy to talk through them. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. So hopefully we get some questions. Janelle, I can't see any questions coming through. I'm not sure if you can on your end. Thank you, Martin. I'm taking no questions as a good sign. But as I said, if you do think of anything later, obviously this presentation is recorded, so you can watch back. You can read the article that will be posted with the presentation and reach out if something still isn't quite clear or you want to work through a specific example. We'd be more than happy to help. Oh, I think we have one question. Oh no, it was just Joseph saying that I was clear and focused, but thank you very much, Joseph and Martin, for your kind comments. I think then we can probably end the webinar there, Janelle.